Thank you all for coming. Okay. Digital platforms are powerful. Some analysts would say this headline is wrong, that in fact the number ought to be 8 out of 10 of the most valuable companies in the world are powered by platforms. Some analysts would add Tesla. Now you might ask, why Tesla? Where's that a platform? It's becoming increasingly obvious to at least many, that a lot of the value that's being created by Tesla is not simply in the pipeline of building cars, but it's in the data that it's gathering from drivers and from the cars themselves, building the foundation of the next generation of autonomous vehicles. However, our observation is that the power of platforms has not yet penetrated healthcare. And we observe, we use this carefully, that platforms are understood mostly as a technology construct within healthcare. That's not wrong, but it is severely limiting. Okay, so we have some evidence to prove our point here, although it's somewhat anecdotal. So a survey from HFS Research and Infosys surveyed 100 health plan C-level executives. And the results were paradoxical. One of the findings was that over 90% of the executives did label their digital platforms as a must-have, not a nice-to-have, a must-have. However, when they were asked about their objectives for deploying platforms, what you see is the number one answer at 38% is reducing administrative costs. So what's missing here is an understanding and a response of the potential for platforms to be central to organizational strategy, operational strategy, and business strategy. So part of, I guess, one of our central themes, our hopes today, is to illustrate the potential power of platforms, how it can better patients' lives within healthcare, and to make platforms as central to operational and to business strategy. We quote our colleague, Sangeet Paul Chowdhury, who's one of the co-authors of Platform Revolution, and he points out that the single differentiating factor in what determines whether a platform is successful or not is network effects. Randy, and we'll be talking about network effects throughout this. You already know a lot about network effects. That's the reason it's so hard to leave Facebook. You can leave Facebook, you can't take your friends with you. That's the network effect. So here's a tour, briefly, of where we're going to take today's agenda. It was humbling for Randy and I, as we were putting this together, to really understand the level where we had to start. So the first section is going to be 4, 5, 6 slides about the very, very basics of platforms. Then we'll set some context about platforms in healthcare. And then we will share with you what is our vision of 4 megatrends of platforms within healthcare. Now, let me explain the narrative briefly. Number 1 talks to 4 trends that all of you in healthcare will be familiar with. And we're going to explain a synergy where these trends are driving adoption, and in turn, it's a flywheel effect. Adoption drives the trends further. Second, after the environment is fertile in megatrend number 1, we'll show that the investment dollars are available. Third and fourth is really around the beginnings of a vision of transforming healthcare. Megatrend 3, doing this from an operational level, and Megatrend 4, platforms are transforming the competitive landscape in healthcare. Okay, with that, Randy, I will hand it to you.
Thanks, Vince, and let me add my welcome. I appreciate that you all made the time to join us today. And I'll have to add that it's been a lot of fun to collaborate with my co-chairs for the event, Vince and Jeff, so thank you for that opportunity. So let's level set. Most of us in the room, I suspect, and those online joining us come from a healthcare background, may not be platform native in our thinking. Some of you are, and so I apologize, but let's start with some level setting about what is a platform, what isn't it, and what's the power economically that's created by platform-based business models. So let's start with traditional or so-called pipeline business models as a level set of where we're coming from. If you think about it, most of us are used to businesses that either produce products or services, and they would do so in a stepwise function. Maybe step one, in this case of an automobile manufacturer, is sourcing component parts and steel, whereas step two might be assembling those into a featured vehicle, and then step three, shipping them off to a distributor's showroom and ultimately selling them to a consumer in their target market. And of course, as value is accumulated at each of those steps, it ultimately is translated to the end user, in this case, an automobile driver. Likewise, in return, a linear process tends to occur in terms of how value is captured and monetized, and dollars tend to flow backward through that pipeline such that consumers are paying distributors, and distributors are paying for their inventory from manufacturers, and manufacturers are paying, in turn, their raw material providers. Well, in this situation, digital technologies do indeed exist, but by and large, they're there to increase the efficiencies of flows through this pipeline. So in terms of automating supply chains, for example, or maybe factory floor automation, capturing value from the customer is another one. But those same digital technologies in pipeline businesses tend not to be used, or at least inherently aren't used, to generate something, as Vince has referred to, called network effects. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Well, contrast that with digitally enabled platform-based business models. And here the key is not producing a product or a service and having a customer consume it, but rather interacting, creating and hosting interactions and exchanges between producers and consumers. And in this case, the platform plays a very fundamentally different business role. It's not to produce and sell, it's actually to match, to learn about, and to ultimately add value to those interactions and engagements. So the platform has to play some very specific roles in that particular paradigm. For example, identifying and engaging users, keeping them sticky to the platform, using information from that platform to understand the needs and wants and desires of those users, and then matching those needs and wants with the opportunities to serve or provide products to them as part of the producer community. And if you think about it, while healthcare by and large is the former model, we think there are some good examples, and we'll hear many more from our panels this afternoon, about where healthcare is beginning to understand the economic power of platforms and being able to represent how connecting and exchanging is another important value in especially a data-intensive environment like healthcare. I want to call out one example here, and that is SureScripts. SureScripts is sort of the poster child of the platform and network effect in healthcare. Fortunately, we have one of their early strategic thinkers here in the audience and participating on a panel later to tell us more about that. But from my understanding, SureScripts was able to match the need for prescriptions to flow through a digital pipeline from providers to the supply chain, in this case pharmacies, and through that experience benefit from what I'm going to talk about next, and that's network effects. So platforms, importantly, are different from pipeline businesses, first and foremost because they have a different business function, and that is to create and facilitate exchanges. But the second is that they leverage the power economically of something called network effects. I'll use the illustration of the telephone network as an example. If you think about it, two individuals who each have a telephone have one possible connection between them. Whereas if that number of end users rises to 5, assume for a minute that that's moved through a linear process, it turns out that the number of connections has actually exponentially increased, in this case to 10. And as you move that up to 12 phones, the network of connections is now 66. So again, the power here is the network effect. And that power is exponentially scalable and exponentially more efficient, as Jeff has talked about. More users, more value, and more value, more users. Well, while platforms are powerful business constructs, they're not necessarily easy to build. Here are two particular areas where we think there are some specific challenges. Healthcare won't be immune to these, but we'll need to consider these in general. So things like design and architecture, how to monetize, how to open or not open the platform to others to participate, how the transactions and interactions are governed, and what metrics are used to optimize those interactions. On the strategic side, what types of platform network effects do we want to exploit? How strong are those? Are there potential for us as a business to capture a winner-take-all type of opportunity? And lastly, and most importantly, the chicken and egg or so-called cold start problem. And just to highlight this one for a moment, and we'll hear from others about this, oftentimes platforms have to achieve a critical mass in order for the transactions and exchanges to have sufficient value to the parties to want to participate in the platform. So if you think about this in healthcare, the example would be the resident match. So anybody who's here as a physician has been through the match. And every one of us will tell you that it's both the most apprehensive day of our career and also the most exhilarating. And what the residency match program does is it matches available slots for residents to do their training with recent medical graduates to fill those slots. And it does so on a national basis. But they had to overcome the chicken and egg and cold start problem because if they didn't have enough residency programs participating, none of the residents would bother to use that platform in order to secure their next career move, and vice versa. In this case, the problem was solved by pursuing residency programs first, and then resident matches followed. So with that in mind, let me hand off to Vince, and I'm sure he's going to tell us why healthcare is even more complicated than platforms in general.
Yes. Something I forgot to mention. These slides are available. They're on the MIT website, and I put them up on my Twitter feed at Vince Kreitis if you're interested. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare and platforms. Okay, it's worth recognizing that healthcare is not like other industries, and I don't have the time to go into it today, but there's a long list of reasons why. At the very top, we have a fundamental disagreement. In the US, it's much more of a market good. You go to other developed countries, you find government paying for 90% of healthcare. It's much more looked at as a human right. But I do want to talk about this last issue of fragmentation within healthcare, if I can find the right button. Okay. This is actually one of the most important and hopefully insightful slides in here, if you'll bear with me for a little bit. The question you might pose is, if not a platform, well, what else? Okay, there's only two ways to go about connecting people or technologies in a network. And one of them is through point-to-point interfaces. In this example, we've got 6 stakeholders in healthcare, and the number of connections is almost exponential. Among these 6 stakeholders, there's 15 different potential connection points. A platform greatly simplifies this, and the number of connection points is simply the number of participants. So to give you a couple of examples here with the math, we thought of a complex diabetic patient who's got a primary care physician, an endocrinologist, remote monitoring devices, mHealth apps, a diabetic educator, et cetera, et cetera. We counted 13 different nodes. That's 91 different potential connection points. Or you could look at that as 91 different failure points where information doesn't flow. By point to point, what we mean is essentially as it's done in healthcare today, through phone, through fax, through email, something done in person. One more quick example. The number of specialists in a typical primary care physician's referral network, the number done in a study about a decade ago is 229. The math there translates through over 26,000 different connection points. So we pose a not so rhetorical question of, can you imagine Uber, Airbnb, or Amazon even attempting to operate point-to-point phone, fax, email? We can't imagine this. Yet, that's exactly how we've structured our healthcare system. Why do we keep doing it this way? Healthcare platforms and strategy are different. Again, I simply want to make the headline. I don't have time for all of the details in here. But I also do want to acknowledge the last point about the dark side of platforms, and that we're not blind to that. Platforms are subject to misinformation. They're subject to winner-take-all, an imbalance between the platform and the users of the platform. And platforms also tend to have fairly high failure rates. That's because, as Randy referenced, there's this chicken and egg problem, and a lot of platforms don't get past that chicken and egg problem. Okay, so now let's go to the 4 healthcare megatrends. Again, we're setting a narrative here. And this megatrend really goes to setting the environment, the environmental readiness. And it's a fairly simple point, although I'm going to walk you through some details. There's synergy. Platforms in advance and are advanced by 4 key trends. Okay, to back up a little bit. Healthcare has been on a 25-year journey towards digitization, electronic health records, and interoperability. The pegging point we'll start is in 2004, when President Bush said, let's have all Americans have a healthcare record, an electronic healthcare record. 2009, Obama and Congress passed the HITECH Act that poured $35 billion over the course of the next few years into adoption of electronic health records, which unfortunately didn't really solve the interoperability problem. 2015, McKinsey study documented, they looked at digital adoption across 22 different industry sectors. No surprise really to all of us who are steeped in healthcare. Healthcare was number 19. And this is much, it's not all, but it's much of the explanation of why platform adoption is more than a decade behind, because we've been late at digitizing stuff. In 2016, we had the 21st Century Cures Act, which effectively mandates interoperability, but the legislation, we're going to be through this, we're going to be going through this for the rest of this decade. We're not there yet. It's a very long journey. Okay? So 4 forces driving adoption in healthcare. I'm going to just highlight these for you. And this, I'm building a table. It's going to seem complex, but it's not about the detail in the table. I'm really trying to get across a concept to you. Value-based care and payment, moving away from paying for healthcare piecemeal through fee-for-service, which incentivizes providers to do more without regard for quality, and moving toward a delivery system and a reimbursement system that incentivizes quality and improved outcomes. The second trend, consumerism, moving away from a healthcare system that is organized for the benefit of care providers and moving toward a system that is truly organized around the needs of the patient centricity. The third trend is interoperability and data sharing, moving away from data stored in silos and viewed by providers as our asset, and moving toward a healthcare system where data is shared appropriately and widely, and in turn can be used for analysis to benefit the greater population, not just individual patients. And then finally, a fairly new one kicked off by COVID, or really advanced by COVID, is home and virtual care. So instead of care being provided in centralized doctor's offices and hospitals, it's moved towards the community, wherever the patient may be, a hybrid level of care. Okay. In turn, on the left axis, there are platform capabilities needed to support trends. And I'll give you an example. I'll walk through an example in a second. And again, there's a lot of detail, but what I want you to take away from this is the overlap of the kinds of capabilities that are needed across these four trends. And let's walk through an example. So what kinds of capabilities, again, the ones that are uniquely suited to platforms, do you need in order to achieve value-based care and payment? Risk management, cost management, the sharing of data, coordinating care, analytics, shared workflow. So let me present this to you visually. In the first example that we just showed you, what we're trying to demonstrate is a flywheel effect, a positive cycle where healthcare platform adoption drives value-based care and payment, and value-based care and payment in turn drives healthcare adoption. And the same with the consumerism trend, and the same with the interoperability and data sharing trend, and to round it out. So that's where we present you with a really very optimistic future, and hopefully we'll have to go home and think about this a little bit, but it's really quite synergistic. The environment, the trends that are occurring in healthcare very much feed the need and the adoption of platforms in the very near future. That's megatrend number one. So, Randy, I'm going to hand it to you for megatrend number two.
Thanks, Vince. Vince has done a great job of showing us where some of the market forces that are at play broadly in healthcare are fueling platform opportunities. And I want to show you where that fuel needs to be leveraged on top of a digital infrastructure and capitalized in order to emerge. So healthcare is clearly, as Vince talked about, undergoing digital transformation. There's been a 25-year journey. It's clearly accelerated over the last decade. And at this point, data is considered in healthcare to be the new oil. If you think about it, virtually every other data-intensive sector, like retail or finance, for example, has had that digital infrastructure laid for a while and is starting to monetize that around analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and new business opportunities to engage with and support consumer journeys. Well, healthcare is behind, but it's not that far behind. I hope to show you that. First of all, for starters, 90% of physician offices now have an EMR, and that's only after a decade of effort. Virtually every hospital in the country at this point has an EMR. Vince will tell me it's EHR, sorry about that, EHR. And that infrastructure is not just broad, it's actually quite scalable, with big tech companies at this point, every one of them having a dedicated healthcare cloud business unit. A lot of that infrastructure is now in the cloud and able to be scaled. These big tech companies are sitting on a boatload of cash. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But suffice it to say, they're not just sitting on it. They're deploying it to also begin owning digital assets that go beyond their cloud computing capabilities. You all are familiar with Oracle's recent acquisition of the EHR company Cerner. And Microsoft, about a year or so ago, acquiring Nuance, which is a voice technology that's used by providers in the interactions with the EHR. Well, that digital infrastructure is also receiving an unprecedented level of capital investment and interest from investors. This is data from Rock Health as well as others that suggest that over the last year, investments in the digital health sector, these are digitally native healthcare companies built on that infrastructure that's been laid, are now consuming on the order of $30 billion in annual investment. Now, clearly over the last 6 months, that's come down substantially like it has more broadly in other sectors of the economy, but that pace is unprecedented. Interestingly, this level of growth, while it may not be sustainable, has already led to several successful exits and fuels the interest from investors as well as the breadth of the interest from different institutional investors. And it doesn't speak to what big tech is able to leverage, and that is sitting on nearly $500 billion in cash available to invest in the digital assets of healthcare. Well, that digital health investment is also fueling an emerging trend, and that is investment in platform healthcare businesses. This is work from Summit Health that looked at digital health investments, and from CB Insights also looking at digital health investments. And the sector of digital health, while big and growing, is now about 40% consumed by digital platform healthcare investment dollars. And at this point, between a third and 40% of digital health companies are platform-based companies, with addressable markets that are quite substantial, looking at trillions of dollars potentially, and importantly, commanding valuation premiums that are approaching 3 times higher than the digital health native companies alone. So clearly, this infrastructure has been laid for platforms to emerge from a technology perspective, but also from a digital health investment perspective. Here's where we see some of the future likely probable areas for healthcare platforms to begin emerging. Things like virtual health and telehealth, wellness and caregiver support, moving beyond the 4 walls of the infrastructure of healthcare, and then clinical niches that have to do with a continuum of care as opposed to acute or episodic care. And then lastly, artificial intelligence and machine learning, analytics and provider support platforms as well. So let me move from digital health investments and digital infrastructure to the next megatrend, which is layering on top of these infrastructure and capital investments, new opportunities to see emerging operating models as a result of platforming in healthcare. So in this megatrend, I want to point out that none of us in the room or online would ever argue that healthcare is fundamentally a not very functional operating system. At this point, the operating models of healthcare remain challenged. I think there are 3 specific areas I want to call out that represent opportunities for platforms to emerge to solve some of the fundamental and structural problems of our healthcare operations. The first is technology infrastructure. And while we've talked about how there have been a lot of advances in healthcare's digitization, most of this data and infrastructure is facility-based, as Vince has said, in EHRs that are not only facility-based, where acute care is provided, but oftentimes not interoperable, even when the vendor is the same vendor between different entities using that solution. And importantly, providers of healthcare who interact with these legacy systems spend on the order of 15 minutes in every clinical encounter just interacting with that technology rather than focusing on the ability to deliver care or optimize clinical workflow. In addition, structurally, the data model is not ready for prime time. The data model of healthcare is, again, largely locked up in systems that are not interoperable, and it turns out that the vast majority of healthcare data, according to this McKinsey data point, resides in the rest of the world. It's where you and I work and sleep and play and entertain. It's generated by us as humans, not by doctors in an EHR. And then importantly, the EMRs are provider-centric in their function. They solve a problem which is mainly documentation that's required for the physicians or hospital providers to be reimbursed. At the end of the day, these data models don't really support digital health except in niches and point solutions because of the lack of interoperability. But again, a place where platforms will begin to make inroads. The third operating challenge in healthcare is the care model itself. And as a result of providers having historically been the gatekeeper of decision-making, referral patterns, prescription authority, et cetera, the care model has had to flow through that provider. As a result, it often lacks coordination between and amongst providers, and it's focused on sick care rather than wellness and prevention for the very most part. It tends to be facility-based, again, rather than community or home-based. And all of this in aggregate has led to a system that suffers from disparities of access to care, affordability of that care, workforce-related shortages and challenges, provider burnout, which is a large and growing issue, and then a mismatch between the value that's created by our current healthcare operations and what it costs to deliver that value. All this has been clearly exacerbated by the pandemic. Well, the good news is that platforms are beginning to liberate data and empower consumers to start to change those operating models. First of all, from a tech infrastructure, platforms in healthcare are typically cloud-native entities. They're interoperable from the get-go. They have employed APIs and other standards for sharing of data across and outside of the platform. Again, because their fundamental job is to exchange amongst consumers and producers. And then lastly, data access and mobile-friendly solutions help support customer journeys, and in this case, patient journeys. The data model has begun to exploit areas of wellness, begun to utilize healthcare data that's generated by consumers to augment their models and go well beyond the transaction of face-to-face care. And then these point solutions that once were focused on a specific niche are able to be interoperable and integrated. And then again, this liberated data and informed and activated consumer is now driving new operating models of healthcare delivery. This care model is no longer always gatekept by a clinical provider. Often the platform is beginning to step in and play that function. The patient's view tends to be more holistic and extend well beyond the interaction, in between the interaction and outside of the interaction. And then virtual care is emerging as an important and growing model of care delivery, as well as home-based care. And of course, in healthcare, at the end of the day, all care is provided by physicians and doctors and nurses and others. And so a hybrid between virtual and in-person care is something that's also being facilitated through integrated platform hybrid models. Well, we think there are a number of enablers that make healthcare ready and prime for operational transformation through platforms, but also some constraints. And let me point out some of these. I look forward to this afternoon's panel discussions where those who are building platform businesses can talk to us about how they're navigating through this landmine of potential enablers and constraints. It's our viewpoint, however, that healthcare is in the earliest phases of experimenting on transformational operational models. And so with that, I'll hand back to Vince and let him land the plane.
Okay. All right, we're in the home stretch here. So reminding you of the narrative, Megatrend 1 kind of sets the framework, the environment is ripe. 2, the investment dollars are there. 3rd, the operations are changing. And then this megatrend goes to the transformation of the competitive landscape in healthcare. Okay. Incumbents today, I kind of feel sorry. They're feeling under siege. There's a barrage of new platform competitors that are either platform native companies or that have a significant platform component to their business model. Interestingly, though, a Chartis Group survey of hospital health executives documented that they get it. They responded, the number one competitor, not surprisingly, is other hospitals and health systems. But now, up at number 2, the recognition is virtual care platforms are the number 2 competitor to traditional health systems. And not surprisingly, number 3 is big tech. So as the landscape changes, incumbents are fighting back. We observe the rise of collaborative platforms. A company that's building EHR apps to connect doctors and hospitals, XHealth, has 14 different hospital health system investors. 21 investors in Truveta, which is gathering data across 21 different health systems, combining it, de-identifying it. And then the third one, which I'll talk about a little bit, is Graphite Health. Graphite Health essentially is building an app store around EHRs. And the process typically takes around 2 years. They want to shorten it to months. So back to our complex diabetic patient. If you're a primary care physician and say you've got 100 patients and they're using 20 different diabetic applications, the chances are you're probably going to pay attention to close to 0 of them. So what Graphite Health is doing is vetting legally and clinically and then curating. So I don't know what the final number is going to be. So instead of thousands of different digital health apps that are out there, or diabetic apps, you'll be told use one of these 3, or perhaps one of these 2, or maybe even only on one of these 1. A centralization around the app process. Okay, this headline is a mouthful, but I'm going to walk you through it and hopefully explain it as we go along. Today's healthcare point solutions will be absorbed into or will build upon platforms. So first, let me explain the problem. There are 350,000 mHealth apps, roughly, thousands of digital health companies. So from the patient's point of view, let's say I were a 60-year-old woman with diabetes and asthma. Do I select a point solution, a primary care solution, because I'm a woman? Do I select one that's targeting diabetics? Do I select one that's targeting asthmatics? I mean, it's a difficult choice. Do I pick all of them? From the employer or the health plan perspective who is trying to buy apps to offer to their patients, it's also an equally challenging perspective. To quote a colleague, Joe Connolly, who's the CEO of Visana Healthcare, he said he heard from an HR executive that they'd had their door knocked on by 17 different digital health companies in one day, okay, that are incompatible. So the answer is you probably choose none of them. So in the platform world, the specialization of point solutions is no longer incompatible with the integration of the platform. And to document this, I'll ask you to look no further than your smartphone. Okay, think of the devices or the software that you would have had to have purchased independently prior to the smartphone world. A weather app, a flashlight, a camera, a video game, a navigation system. Now they're all integrated into your phone. So how does this happen in healthcare? When we say absorbed into, and I think I'll be curious to hear what Roy from Amwell has to say later on. They're certainly on this route of consolidation, merger acquisition, or they will be built upon where we will see these apps built upon platforms and there will be a consolidation in the industry. Okay, FHIR APIs are going to be mandated by the end of 2022 for transferring healthcare information. I think this has been viewed as a technical challenge. It also ought to be viewed as a business opportunity and a business threat. And the question we will pose will be, or the statement we'll make is, every healthcare organization should be thinking of itself as a digital platform. We're required to use APIs effectively. That makes you a platform. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Okay, anticipating mega platforms and super apps. You got to have a 10-year time frame on this one, but we think it's likely to happen. You look at not every, but you look at a lot of other industries where platforms dominate. Amazon and e-commerce, Facebook, Twitter and social, Google and search. Okay, that's the tendency. So to see what this is going to look like, you really have to look outside of the United States. And an example that we'll point to is Ping An Healthcare within China. What they offer: healthcare information, medical services, drugs, supplements, and health plans. And they're part of a larger technology network that's offering financial services. A couple of factoids, if I can remember them correctly. 420 million registered users in China and 1.3 billion, with a B, consults that took place in 2021. You know, as a reference point, the publicly traded telehealth company, Teladoc, did about 15 million visits last year. Okay? So we're just scratching the surface here, and we hope that we have piqued your interest. We're aware of over 40 books on platform strategy. This is a great place to start. Our illustrious co-chair is the lead author here. Translated into 10 languages, 300,000 copies sold. Randy and I are working on the healthcare version of this book. We have started the healthcare blog. Our podcast will be debuting next month. The video and the stuffed animals are in negotiations. We'll share that later. Okay, I would like to end on a note that hopefully will be seen as upbeat, provocative, and aspirational. And we'll suggest that healthcare will become the pinnacle platform industry. Again, give this a decade. Pinnacle meaning in terms of broad adoption and in terms of value that is able to be provided to humankind. Our thinking here. First is the strength of the value proposition here. We're not just talking having conversations or selling stuff. We're talking about saving lives, eliminating pain, human suffering, the value proposition of healthcare. I mean, we all understand that. Second, the volume and velocity and value of data in healthcare, like no other industry. I think intuitively we know that. Third, I expect Dr. Sue Woods will have a few comments here. Consumers are demanding better experiences. They want better interfaces, better experiences. And finally, there's another hill over the data interoperability hill, the workflow interoperability hill. We're not going to be able to solve that without the use of platforms. So we do have just a couple of minutes left for questions. We'll thank you for that. And Jeff, you have some questions for us?
Well, first of all, great. On that, so it blanks out. We do have a couple of questions. So first of all, we have an audience online, and that's how we'll be able to interact. Is the tool called Slido is with hashtag platforms22. So we have the first question that just came in. Please have a seat, gentlemen. Is how do you believe the adoption of the FHIR standards will progress across the various nodes in healthcare, i.e. labs, hospitals, pharmacies, et cetera?
I think it's a real game changer. And maybe to back up a little bit, we started with a slide that talked about a 25-year march towards digitization, EHR's interoperability. And the FHIR standard, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, effectively comes into being mandated at the end of 2022, and it requires the use of FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources is the acronym. It's an API. APIs are the universal standard of how information is exchanged on platforms. And the fact that this is now being mandated in healthcare has huge implications. It's really too early to understand that, but I would flag it as a critical event for us to keep an eye on, and I think history will show it to be one of the major milestones in advancing interoperability.
Other questions? So we can take one. I've got one online, but if we also want to take one live, that's also possible. You are, after all, in a room. So while you compose those, what is the role of pharma, platform builder, orchestrator, or participant?
Yes.
All of the above.
That's what we love about platforms. You can decide to be a consumer, a producer, a platform host, all the above. And I would say many who want to tackle platform business model strategy ought to consider each one of those and figure out where they can create the most value, not only for their own firm, but for their constituents. And from a pharma perspective, I think at a minimum, we're seeing pharma take advantage of platform-driven data and intelligence through artificial intelligence, machine learning, to shorten the cycle time of product development. Ultimately, virtually delivered clinical trials, which are being conducted through virtual care platforms, are facilitating speed to market. And I think that, who knows where it's going to go from there. Maybe a couple of our panelists in particular are going to be able to speak to that.
Another question that just came in is how much of the currency of platforms will be data, i.e. interoperability, versus people, i.e. staffing?
I think the history will show that data in healthcare will have more value to contribute than in other industries. I think we've touched on that in pointing out the value proposition here is really life and death. And my personal view is, the science of medicine is still pretty early. We are going to make some huge discoveries over the next 20, 50, 100 years.
And we'll hear more about this as well from our panelists, but healthcare is steeped in culture, and I would describe that culture as largely a gatekeeper culture. Guilty as charged because I'm the doc on the panel. But that said, I think data will go first, but it won't be limited to data. I think you'll see workflows change as a result of that data, and therefore human resourcing and who does what, where, and when change as a result of that. Come on up to the microphone. Oh, we'll come back.
Thank you. This has been so illuminating. Healthcare is primarily a very interpersonal and an experience with traditionally a healthcare provider. And I'm just curious about the role of the care that comes with healthcare and how you see platforms addressing the interpersonal needs in the high stakes kinds of conversations and situations that patients find themselves in.
Well, Vince and I were talking about this over coffee this morning, so I'll allude back to that conversation. I'm going to put your comment about high stakes care to the side for a minute and recognize that the vast majority of care opportunities is well up front of that. And I hope we all continue to take advantage of that, right? Avoid the high stakes ones. That said, my perspective is that platforms exist to understand the needs of their constituents and match those needs appropriately with the right resources and responses. And so from a healthcare perspective, we've always taken the viewpoint that we need to figure out what providers or payers need and then build solutions to assist that or accelerate that. I think platforms are beginning to recognize that there's a whole other third leg of the stool out there, and that is the consumer of our healthcare systems, processes, workflows, et cetera. And I think platforms offer a really unique opportunity to better understand those needs, much of which will be driven from data. But if you think about it, Netflix, which is what we're talking about over coffee, understands my interests and my needs really pretty well at this point, right? Without a ton of data, they're able to help curate and coordinate offers and opportunities for my entertainment. And I think healthcare will move in that direction to assist, for example, in patient journeys. There are companies, a company that comes to mind called Jasper, which is helping craft a platform to assist the patient journey of cancer and walk people through that experience in a much more consumer-friendly, palatable, and ingestible way.
So I'm going to just answer one more question here, if you would please, and then we're going to have to sadly put a halt because I've got way more questions here than you're going to be able to answer. But maybe talk a bit about the incumbents and their platform strategy. And it's sort of an evergreen problem, which is, do you see success in building, buying, or partnering?
Yeah, so I think as an incumbent, there's different levels you can approach this. Let's take a health system. You know, a good approach would be to take an existing technology platform and think about building a strategy around it. You've got an EHR, you've got a patient portal. How can you make a strategy? The next level, the better, is to take a look at thinking of the health system as a platform and all the different partners that you interact with in the community, pharma companies, device companies. You know, that's another level of beginning to think about strategy. And the best level is really at the ecosystem level, where a health system would recognize that it's a player. The thing about platform strategy is you don't have to throw out your existing strategy. You can start with identifying a particular platform technology that you may have. You can start incrementally. It's not either or in terms of the strategy. And I think we'll see an evolution of this. And the prime example, I think, you know, we've seen 4 or 5 health systems. Mayo is perhaps the most vocal, where they've identified the Mayo Clinic platform. You know, if you listen to Dr. Halamka, he has very ambitious plans to really to make Mayo an international asset, a referral center, a resource across industry or across national boundaries. It's not either or. It's a matter of adapting a platform strategy can be done on top of what you're already doing. Thank you.
Gentlemen,
This
thank
was
you so
fun.
much.
Thank you.